How much of the people that you came across, where was the line drawn in terms of how much they would use or be willing to use violence as a tactic, right? I mean, because we have the example in Charlottesville where Antifa is credited by members of the clergy, not just Cornel West, but others, with protecting them, with literally protecting these people's lives who were, sort of more pacifistic protesting, and they stepped in where the police would not, and by all accounts, at the very least, protected them from serious harm. We also have accounts of people going up and randomly punching people they deem to be Nazis. And, I don't know, there was a story out of last week, or I guess a week or two ago, in Oakland, Reveal News, a guy named Will Carlos, they had been, reporting on some Antifa in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one guy was talking about, we'll go into their houses and we will take them out if we have to, preemptively. I mean, where are these lines drawn, or is it just an individual thing, or is it just a local group to local group? Where is that line?
Certainly, I can't comment on every single instance, but certainly, it's a decentralized politics. It's a politics of autonomous groups, and different groups will, of course, just as really with any autonomous politics, make their own decisions about tactics and context and who to organize against. That's true of any kind of decentralized politics, but of course, especially true in a context like this. Among the people that I spoke to, it was all very contextual. It's different to speak to someone in Greece. I spoke to an organizer of an anti-fascist martial arts tournament there because there had been extensive fascist infiltration into the martial arts scene, so we organized that. Certainly in places like Russia, about a dozen anti-fascists have been murdered over the last decade, so that's different from a place like the Netherlands, where usually guns and knives are not even part of the equation. In the U.S., having a very open gun policy makes the conversation different. It's very contextual, but the people that I spoke to emphasize that if they can stop a white power event simply by making phone calls or writing letters or organizing a boycott, that's always preferable. That in their perspective, when you get a confrontation, to some extent that's kind of a last resort, where the kind of other methods of stopping far-right organizing by doxing their leaders, trying to disrupt their internal apparatus have failed. Of course, it's always a subjective thing. It's always a matter of interpretation and context. And, there's not much more to say beyond that. It's a question that also was really hotly debated in the 20s and 30s. At what point does fascism become threatening enough to stand up to it? How should we stand up to it? These are not always clear questions. I think it's important for everyone to grapple with them and not always think about them in terms of absolutes, but think of them contextually based on their communities and their own concerns.
Well, trying to sort of narrow that context, right? Because I think this is where it starts getting trickier for people. Because I think most people, even if they don't identify as Antifa, would have no problem. Let me put it this way. When people were being ID'd from photos from Charlottesville on Twitter,
right.
And, my feeling was I'm a little nervous to engage in that because sometimes you start IDing people improperly. Like, that's Bill McKenzie. And it turns out Bill McKenzie was like, that's not me. And all of a sudden, his garage is burned down or something. But aside from that, okay, but the idea in principle, I don't think most people, would have an issue with that. Identifying people who are out there, in public, having their pictures taken, marching, in support of Confederate monuments. But I think, from there, it starts getting a little bit murkier. And I'm just curious, from the context of the work that you've done, within the United States, right, where I think, at least this audience, the vast majority of this audience has a better sense of like, what of that context. Like where is that line drawn with most of the Antifa people that you have come across? Like, is it preemptive? Is it preventative? Is it self-defense? I mean, where is that line drawn in terms of violence?
Right. Well, certainly the anti-fascist interpretation of self-defense is broader than what probably many people would espouse. They think of self-defense in an anti-fascist context as not only being in terms of immediate self-defense, but also being preemptive. That's essentially because they don't give fascism or white supremacy the kind of benefit of the doubt of, will this group become violent? Will this group pose a threat to local communities? They essentially assume from the outset, based on the historical record, that these groups, by virtue of existing, pose a danger, and they'll do whatever they think is necessary, not whatever they think, but whatever they think is necessary to try and stop them. And sometimes that will mean confronting groups at demonstrations before they necessarily even do anything, because of the argument that these politics are not just a difference of opinion, but pose a threat. And we can see in different places around the U.S., around the country, that when these groups establish local hubs, violence does follow. And so the argument is that rather than waiting for someone to get beat up and then everyone raises an outcry and marches out, or you can even see in Charlottesville, it was unfortunate that it took the death of Heather Heyer for so many people to take this seriously. They argue we know that these things will keep happening, and so in that sense they have a preemptive understanding of self-defense, and that is a political difference that they'll have with a lot of people, but that's how they see it.
And one of the things that's difficult, I guess, about these tactics in this perspective is measuring its success rate. I mean, there was a piece on the National Memo, and here's a quote from it from Lindsay Beierstein. Paramilitaries facing off in the streets is God's gift to fascism. Not everyone likes racism and militarism, but everyone likes safety and order. If we've already got safety and order, fascists have nothing to offer casual supporters. So in other words, when there are images on the television of fascists and anti-fascists fighting, even if the fascists started it, the inclination, the argument goes here, the inclination is for most people just saying, like, I want just there not to be fighting on my television. Yeah. So I'm willing to give the Trump administration and the local police force more authority to go and arrest all of them. I mean, what's the counter argument to that? And to the extent that we have any data on success of these tactics, what is there?
So there's 2 points to make. First, I'll look at the sort of 20s, 30s, and 40s, and then I'll look at more recently. So in terms of the older examples, we can see that there was street fighting between fascists and anti-fascists in virtually every country of Europe in the interwar period. What determines whether or not you get fascism is less the violence per se and more the economic conditions and the ability of the traditional elites to project power for the local industrialists or agriculturalists. So in Germany, for example, you do have paramilitary formations and veterans associations across the political spectrum from the end of World War I onward. The Nazis didn't actually start to gain power until after the Depression, and at the same time that they gained power or gained support, so did the Communist Party. So simply saying that violence produces it is kind of missing the exact context, because you also have even more fascists numerically in France at the same time. You have similar kinds of conflicts, but the French state managed to maintain control, the economy did better, and you don't get fascism. In terms of recent examples, we can look at the destruction, the stopping of the National Front in Britain, the successes of the anti-fascist movement in Norway in the 1990s, the success of the Jewish anti-fascist veterans organization, the 43 Group in the 1940s. There are a number of examples of this working. It works best when it starts on groups that are small and are rising rather than mass parties. I think that certainly there came a point, right, in the 30s and 40s when popular self-defense was legitimate. We may disagree on when that point was, but to say that it's never legitimate or that it always is counterproductive is, I think, not borne out by the historical evidence.
Hi, folks. Sam Seder here. We still need your help on our Patreon page. YouTube ads have come back, but not nearly as much as we had before. So if you can help us out, any little bit helps. Head over to our Patreon page right at this URL and you'll help us keep helping you by making videos?